Hey everyone, today I want to play a little game with you. It's called Illustration Tropes Bingo. Illustration Tropes Bingo. So the topic today is conceptual illustration. Like, what is a conceptual illustration? Maybe what isn't a conceptual illustration? And then why is it that there are so many illustrations out there that seem to follow the same idea? There's a lot of illustrations that basically riff on the exact same idea, maybe in a little bit of a different style or a different context. That's what I mean by illustration tropes. I'll show you what I mean, and of course we're going to play the illustration tropes game together, the illustration tropes bingo game, I should say. And before I do that, I want to just hop over to Pinterest here on my browser, and I'm going to just do a little search here out in the wild for an illustration that I would consider conceptual. So our first example here is someone in a gas mask. They're sweeping skull and crossbones under what looks to be water, maybe like he's at the edge of a shoreline. And I would say that the idea here is he's sweeping something under the carpet. There's this idiom or this expression, this phrase that people say that when you sweep something under the carpet, you're not really tidying up. You're not doing the job. You're just putting it somewhere else where people can't see. So it looks like you've done your job. I would say I would interpret this illustration as being something about how something toxic or pollution is being kind of buried in the ocean or sunk into the ocean because nobody knows where it's there. And of course, the effects of this long term will be something bad, something dying in the water becoming overly polluted. So that's an example of how a conceptual illustration works. It takes this idea that everybody knows, the idea of sweeping something under the carpet, and then you're using it for a new topic or a more complicated topic, which might be something like pollution or maybe this goes in a news or a magazine article about how an organization, a company, maybe an entire country is being irresponsible with how they dispose of toxic waste. Let's look at another example. Here we have a big giant finger, or is it giant? Maybe that little hand lifting the control key there is really tiny. I don't really know what this means, but it has something to do with control. It has something to do with power. The finger pointing down has a sense of like some authority or big power pushing down on the little guy. It's maybe something lurking under that button, under the surface, who doesn't have as much power. Or another way of reading this would be that you have the hand doesn't look human. It looks almost demonic because it's black and the red color around it is kind of hellish in a way. So maybe this is about AI. Maybe this is about how AI is going to take over and we're not going to have the control we think we have through our physical buttons or hardware or whatever that's a metaphor of. So in this case, this conceptual illustration is some kind of a visual allegory, a little bit of a metaphor, using that control key as the symbol of control in a different sense. Okay, so maybe we'll just look at one last example of a conceptual illustration. We have a woman seated at a computer, and then the beam of light cast from that computer is also kind of representing almost like a crocodile snout. And so obviously it's something about the dangers of being online, or it could be digital. She looks kind of young, so maybe it's about cyberbullying, cyber attacks. There, I just looked at the title up here, cyber attacks. So it's using a kind of metaphor of a carnivorous predator like an alligator. And then, of course, we're also using a pun where we're taking the conical beam of the light shining from the monitor and using that also as the open mouth of the beast. So those are some examples of conceptual illustration, just kind of finding them randomly today. Now I'm going to go to my Skillshare class called Drawing Ideas, where I teach conceptual illustration and how to make one, what goes into it. Some of the stuff that I'm showing you right now. One of the exercises that I have students do is show one example of a conceptual illustration and one example of a non-conceptual illustration. So I'm just here on the class page. This is the one of the students, and this is her project. And as you can see, she's called out 2 illustration examples here. One is conceptual, this red one, she says. And then one is non-conceptual, this one that's or this character in a jail cell. Now, if you look closely, I'll try and zoom into this on in my edit. But it's a calendar, and then there's a woman in there kind of holding the grid of the calendar as though it's prison bars. Whereas in the non-conceptual one, it's a character, it's an illustration, it's not realistic. But in the non-conceptual one, it's just a character holding the prison bars, and they're actually literally in prison. It doesn't matter that it's not realistic. There's no concept here. It's just someone in a jail cell. So the difference is one is more of an idea and one is more of a representation in a more literal sense. Let's look at another example. Okay, so this is a project by Isfan, and for their non-conceptual illustration, they show just an iPhone, like an illustrated iPhone. And then in the conceptual illustration, it's this illustration by Joey Godoni, and it's an iPhone also, but there's people kind of using it or in it as though it's also a bed. So the concept here is something about maybe online dating or hooking up through some kind of app like Tinder on your smartphone, something like that. They're both phones, but one is just like a representation or an illustration directly of a phone, an iPhone. And then the other is more of an idea using the iPhone as a metaphor or symbol of some kind. So now that we're on the same page about what a conceptual illustration is versus a non-conceptual illustration, I think we can go and play our game now. So let's switch views here so you can see my Illustration Tropes Bingo sheet. Okay, so what you're going to see on your screen right now are 2 halves. On the right half, you just have my browser, Google. And then on the left, we have an illustration tropes bingo card. And this is a bingo card, and instead of numbers, we have different little illustrations here. These are what I call illustration tropes. They're kind of like off-the-shelf ideas, or these ideas that you've seen 1,000 times, just played out in different ways, in different styles, and for different contexts. And so let's just zoom in here for a second and take a look at a few of them. So the stack of books, this is a very common illustration trope. You see illustrations where you have basically little tiny people climbing up and down books, maybe to suggest education or imagination or something like that. Another one would be the hand holding a symbolic object. The magic crayon is one that you've seen a lot of, I'm sure, where someone's drawing the thing on which they're climbing. And maybe we'll look at one more piece here. The head montage, that's a very classic one where you have someone's head usually in silhouette, and there's some image kind of juxtaposed over it or inside of the head. And then there's the wall of heads. This would be like where a crowd is represented in a very flat way. So let's go see if we can find any of these just in Pinterest. Pinterest is a great place to look for illustrations, I find, versus just Google, where you end up getting a lot of AI results. And let's just see if we can find the wall of heads. So I would say right at the top here, we have walls of heads. There is a little bit of perspective happening with this one. But what about this one by Stephanie Wunderlich? This one is, well, you have the full body, so it's not as straightforward of a concept. So we'll keep looking. This is close to a wall of heads because you have the full heads and you have a bit of the shoulder, but you don't have the full body. And so it ends up looking just like this flat wall of heads, as I say. As you can see, the composition where you have a crowd and they're filling the whole space in a flat way, from bottom to top, from side to side, in more or less the same perspective. This is what I mean by the wall of heads. You see it all over the place. Each one of these is unique in its own style and its own context, its own meaning. But they all rely on this same basic idea that we've just gone through. We can actually just mark that off as one of the squares. That's one of our bingo squares. Let's see if we can get a line or even a full card today, depending on how much time it's going to take us. And I also just clicked the free space in the middle just to give us a little bit of a head start. Okay, let's do books illustration. Let's see if we can find the stack of books. There are stacks of books, but I'm looking for a very particular stack of books that has someone sitting on it or someone climbing on it. So right away, we found it. And there's some more examples here. This one's a little bit more of an abstract version. We'll just knock that off. Okay. Here's one. I haven't talked about this yet. This is an illustration of what I would call the book as portal. So you open the book and instead of paper and words on it, there's a whole world beyond. And I have that here on my bingo card. And I'll just mark that off with another bingo chip. We'll see if we can find some more examples of this same trope in action. And as you can see, they're all unique in their style. They can all be very different, unique ideas, even though they're based on the same trope. Now, James Steinberg is a textbook study in illustration tropes. If you go to jamessteinberg.com, james-steinberg.com, he's got all kinds of great examples of illustrations, editorial and conceptual illustrations that are based on tropes. And I want to be clear that I'm not dissing tropes. I'm actually teaching you them as a tool for coming up with ideas. And I teach how to use illustration tropes, among other things, to come up with your ideas in conceptual illustration on my class, Drawing Ideas on Skillshare. Okay, now let's look for head illustration. So we have the exploding head. The exploding head is definitely in my tropes here. And if I haven't called it the exploding head, I've called it the open head with or without lid. So there we have it. In some cases, I'll name these tropes different things, but oftentimes when you have a head open, you'll have things exploding out of it. Okay, what about the symbolic shaped hole? So this one might be difficult to find at first, but let's see. Illustration hole. So the symbolic shaped hole illustration is usually when you have something like a speech bubble. Why don't we do that? Speech illustration. I've seen this one a lot, but you'll have like a symbol, like a speech bubble, like a light bulb, a keyhole, something that is clearly symbolic and meaningful. And then it's represented as a hole in the ground, often with a ladder or some kind of climbing device going down into it. Like I said, this one ends up being a little bit harder to find because few people will label or name their illustrations symbolic shaped hole or something like that. But let's just take a look here and see. These are coming very close to what I mean. So here's someone kind of interacting with some kind of a hole that's speech bubble shaped. We have a hole here. It's kind of like a speech bubble. Oftentimes this concept won't have details in the hole. It'll just be like a black hole or a blank hole. But I think this passes as what I'm talking about. But I'm just going to give myself a pass with that, and perhaps we'll come across a closer example as we go. How about the ladder to an unusually large object? This is usually the kind of concept where it's an idea about something that's very abstract. So maybe imagination. I should add illustration to this. Imagination is kind of an abstract term, and so people will struggle to come up with something very directly representative of that, because what does imagination look like? It can look like anything. And then you'll often have people climbing objects I don't know why, but I guess the people add a sort of human quality to it. So I'm going to argue that this person scaling a giant pencil as though it's a mountain with a rope is the same kind of concept as the ladder to an unusually large object. That's because what is a ladder? It's a device for going up and down things. What is a rope in this case? A climbing rope. It's a ladder for going up and down things. So you can replace a ladder with an approximately similar symbol, and it can be the same thing. So if I was being kind of loosey-goosey and easy on myself, I could just call that one done. But if you want to be strict about the ladder to the unusually large object, we're getting closer here, where we have a person on a ladder. This is by Craig Frazier. Actually, Craig Frazier is like James Steinberg, whose illustration work is very much based on illustration tropes. So they specialize in editorial and conceptual illustration. Okay, I found it. This is the ladder to the giant Jenga game. That game where you pull blocks from the bottom and put it on the top until the whole thing falls over. So I found it. Let's see if I can get bingo. So the thematic shelf. That's a pretty easy one to find. So what is a thematic shelf? It's just a trope, like a common type of illustration where people will illustrate a nicely designed shelf with objects on it that relate to a theme. The theme here is probably a little bit more eclectic. It's kind of designy, a little bit retro feeling. You have like the little retro owls and kind of mid-century modern, but more contemporary vibe to it. So this is somewhat thematic shelf. Let's see if we can find something a little bit more overtly thematic. So here we have just a lovely shelf. Again, what is a shelf? It's a display of your things in this case. It's something that doesn't just hold objects in one place in a stack. It's a place that you show something, you express something about yourself or about what you like. Or in the case of an illustration, it's about some kind of common idea. So in this case, the illustration itself, the actual trope itself is a little bit less conceptual. It's more of a format or a composition type, but it is a trope nonetheless. As you can see, it is a well-used trope. Here we have a bit of what looks to be kind of like a toy shelf, a little bit nostalgic. So a lot of the times the thematic shelf is just used to represent a bunch of cool stuff organized in a tidy way. I like to think of the thematic shelf as playing a little bit of a puzzle. It's like, what does the contents on the shelf in the illustration mean? Another illustration type that does this well is what I call the flat lay. But that's a little less conceptual. This is an example of a flat lay, though, where you have objects kind of represented in a flat way with kind of equal space around them, and they're all based on a theme. In this case, it looks like a theme on like crafts, kitchen, household. I'm not really sure. Here's a flat lay of some beautifully illustrated things. It looks like something about a road trip. I can't understand the language here, but there's motor oil, a parking meter, an air freshener that goes on your rearview mirror, car keys. So this is the theme here is something about a road trip, driving or travel. I love these illustrations so much. These are so beautiful. This is about sports. And so obviously not the thematic shelf, but it is a thematic view of objects in a neatly organized way, which arguably is the same idea. It's just a different kind of composition. But we did find a lot of shelves in there. They were thematic. I'm going to give myself a pass. Bingo! I got bingo. And I could probably, with another 5 to 10 minutes, find the rest of the cards worth of tropes. Okay, well, I hope you enjoy playing Illustration Tropes Bingo with me and learning about conceptual illustration a little bit. If you want to get a bingo card like this and play along, students of my new class, Drawing Ideas, on Skillshare, get to download the bingo card for free. And it's actually one of the assignments or exercises in the class that you do on your way towards completing your project. I also have a larger print version of the tropes chart. It's not the bingo card, but there's like 63 tropes on it. So it's a really handy ideation tool. I'll show you real quick what I mean. This little guy right here is my illustration tropes chart. So it has all the little doodles that you saw on the bingo card, plus it has many, many more. All you have to do is be a Skillshare member, and then you have access to all the classes on the platform, including mine, Drawing Ideas. I'll leave a link in the video description that will give you 30 free days of access on Skillshare if you have never been a member before. All right, thank you so much. My name is Mr. Tom Froese. I'll see you in the next video.